sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent.
In the summer of 1776, America stood at a turning point. After a humiliating defeat on Long Island, George Washington had staged an overnight escape to Manhattan, ferrying some 9,500 troops across the water while the British slept. Now, the British and American armies faced each other across the East River. What had begun as a colonial rebellion barely a year before had escalated into a war for independence. It was a war few believed the Americans could win.
The British Empire had just beaten France for world domination. And here were these colonists, 3 million of them, attempting to take on this powerful nation of 3 times its size, with a great navy and a great military force. It just seemed that the odds were all with the British.
We had no money. We had no munitions factories. We had 13 separate states that thought of themselves really as independent sovereign entities and had not a very good record of cooperation. More importantly, a good percentage of the people in this country opposed the revolution, didn't care what happened, didn't care who ruled them.
The troops often lacked enough gunpowder, enough shot, lacked boots, lacked proper uniforms, lacked food, lacked blankets, lacked medicine. In effect, everything you need to equip an army at this time.
What the Americans had was the fact that, to begin with, they were fighting on their own land. They knew their land. They were fighting a defensive war.
We were fighting for something. We had much more to win, much more to lose.
As long as you had enough Americans who still wanted independence and were willing to keep on fighting for it, you could win that war. Not by winning it, but by simply tiring the English out. All the Americans had to do was not lose.
While brandishing all its military might at the Americans, Britain extended an offer for peace. The Americans rejected Britain's offer of peace. Instead, Washington decided to retreat.
I think he understood that if the British captured the commander-in-chief of the American military forces in the first set to, that would be the end of the revolution. So he knew he had to get out of there, actually. The most important thing, and Washington would say this later on, the most important thing was for there to be no major battle in which the generals of the American army were captured.
By not actually losing a major battle with the British, the Americans, in some sense, had already won a strategic victory. But the Revolutionary War was also a civil war, and when some Americans won, there were other Americans who lost. Washington's retreat from New York may have been sound strategy, but it didn't inspire confidence in his military abilities among the rank and file. To boost morale, a more tangible victory was required.
Washington had been kicked out of Long Island, then kicked out of Manhattan with the Continental Army, had come across the Hudson River, had then retreated down through New Jersey. He had then taken his army across the Delaware River. At this moment, General Howe decided, because winter was coming on, and because you normally don't fight in winter, and because Howe also understood that most of the enlistments in Washington's army were due to run out on January 1st, that he felt basically the Americans have lost, and by the time that spring comes along, Washington's army would have evaporated, and the Americans will be willing to discuss coming back into the empire. Howe might well have been right if it were not for Washington and the toughness of his men. Washington was a fighter. His instincts were to fight. And so when he saw that Howe had divided his forces in sort of penny packets, as the British often referred to, through New Jersey, he saw that the German forces in Trenton, which numbered a bit over 1,000, were exposed to a possible American counterattack. And so he takes his army back across the Delaware River on the night of Christmas, surprises and defeats the Germans, captures about 900 of them. The rest fled into the woods, captured large amounts of supplies, and it boosts the spirits of the American army. Most of the men indeed then decided to re-enlist.
White soldiers were not the only ones whose hopes were raised by the victories in New Jersey. There were also black patriots involved from the beginning of the Revolution. And when Washington crossed the Delaware to attack Trenton, Prince Whipple, the bodyguard of Washington's aide, was by his side.
I think African Americans saw the war as an opportunity to seize freedom. Now, in the New England colonies, of course, there were already many free African Americans, and they fought in some of the early battles. As the war continued, though, I think African Americans were cheered by the commitment to liberty and equality, and certainly they expected the war to, in some way, assist them in achieving these things.
In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance.
From the slaves' point of view, freedom was the biggest incentive to fight, and at first, only one side was offering.
Lord Dunmore attempted to slow the American advance by appealing to African Americans to leave their owners and join the British cause, promising them freedom as a result of that. And as a consequence, many African Americans joined the British cause, and the Americans didn't offer. In fact, it was Dunmore's proclamation that encouraged Washington to change his policy.
After 1776, free blacks were officially accepted into the Continental Army. Some states also allowed slaves to enlist. Only South Carolina and Georgia refused to allow blacks to serve in the Continental Army. In these states, a slave's only hope for freedom lay in joining the British. On August 6, 1777, one of the bloodiest battles of the Revolution took place at Oriskany, New York. A rebel militia marching toward Fort Stanwix was ambushed by a large contingent of Indians and Loyalists.
British forces consisted of a number of Tory allies, as well as many Indian allies, many of whom were Senecas.
Fighting with the Americans were their allies, the Oneida Indians.
The Americans, on a very hot morning, marched incautiously through this deep ravine into an ambush, and in the opening battle, between 150 and perhaps 500 of them were cut down.
The two sides fought ferociously, and at the end of the day, the battle was a draw.
There was certainly no gain for either side, and in the long run, the British came off with a considerable loss in this sense. The Indians felt that they had been forced to assume an unfair brunt of the fighting. And in the native way of fighting, they had no patience for standing up and blasting each other in mass squares. The loss of anyone was an irretrievable loss that required replacement and mourning.
Indian disaffection with the British would have larger consequences for the British armies in upstate New York.
One army under Burgoyne was to come down through the Richelieu River corridor that comes down through Lakes George and Lake Champlain toward Albany. And a smaller supporting force was supposed to come through Oswego, capture the American strongpoint at Fort Stanwix, come up the Mohawk Valley, and meet Burgoyne in the Albany area.
The supporting force made it as far as Fort Stanwix, where they laid siege to the American stronghold.
But then the siege fell apart, largely because of Indian disaffection at what had happened at the Battle of Oriskany, and it withdrew. Burgoyne had expected that help to come and meet him, and it never came, resulting in a British defeat which was decisive for the outcome of the war.
In October of 1777, Major General John Burgoyne surrendered 5,000 troops with all of their arms and equipment at Saratoga. It was a crucial turning point in the war.
Our victory over Burgoyne makes the French decide that they will actively come into the war on our side. And it totally changes the strategic equation for the British. What before had been, in effect, a family argument, what before had been a colonial war, in effect now becomes a world war.
For the average American soldier, the euphoria of Saratoga was short-lived. Not long after that victory, American troops prepared to spend the winter at Valley Forge.
Almost everyone has heard of the soldiers of the Revolution being tracked by the blood of their feet on the frozen ground. This is literally true, and the 1,000th part of their sufferings has not, nor ever will be told.
The conditions at Valley Forge were abysmal. You have the problems of weather, cold, rain, sleet, snow. You have problems of illness and disease that struck down many. You didn't have adequate boots. Many of the men were barefoot. On top of that, you have a lack of food. I think particularly bothersome about this was that Valley Forge, being in eastern Pennsylvania, was in the breadbasket of what was then the United States. And yet here we are, the Army living in the midst of plenty and close to starvation. It seemed indeed to the men that their Congress had forsaken them and their own country had forsaken them.
In spite of the hardships, both in battle and in camp, most soldiers remained with the Army.
I do think there was a commitment to the revolutionary ideology. The worth of an individual, the ideas of law and liberty justly used. I think there was also very much a commitment to George Washington as a leader. Washington had shared everything with those men. I think it's very, very difficult at times to quantify such things as comradeship within an army, the bond between a general and an army. At times, I think it is somewhat spiritual, almost mystical. I don't know that you can scientifically analyze it, but somehow there was that bond that held them together.
The winter at Valley Forge showed two things about Washington. He had to show the consistency and the steadiness to just be there and to sit it out through the disease and the suffering of all the troops. And simply by being there, simply by not furloughing himself, by not going back to Mount Vernon, he could be a symbol and in that way a comfort to the troops. But maybe the most important thing Washington did at Valley Forge was to begin the training and the professionalizing of the Army. And that he did with the help of Baron von Steuben.
Von Steuben was not really a baron, but he was an officer in the Prussian army, one of the best forces in Europe at the time.
At this point, the American Army really did not have a set manual of arms or drill instruction. The English had theirs, the French had theirs, the Germans had theirs, and we had not settled on one at this point. What he did was to dumb it down for the Americans, simplify that manual of arms, and then drill the Americans on it over and over and over and over again. Adding to that, von Steuben had an infinite supply of German and English curse words. which he used with great alacrity, often in the same sentence.
Although the troops, in the words of one soldier, had not a scrap of anything but their ragged shirt flaps to cover their nakedness, von Steuben's drills helped keep their minds off of their misery. And in March of 1778, they were cheered by the news that a treaty of alliance had been signed with France. The long winter was nearly over, and soon the war would begin again.
You could see that as they came out of Valley Forge, then in the spring of 1778, and Washington's men meet the British, meet Clinton at Monmouth Courthouse in late June of 1778. Clearly, von Steuben's efforts had paid off. And clearly, this army now was becoming an army that could take on the best of the British units and stand toe-to-toe with them.
The battle at Monmouth Courthouse would prove far more important than Washington originally intended.
And for 2 years, there had been a string of battles around New York and around Philadelphia. The British had captured New York, then they'd gone on to capture Philadelphia. Then at the end of 2 years, they realized they weren't gaining anything, really, by holding Philadelphia. So they decided to march back to New York. As they were going back, Washington decides to follow them closely through New Jersey. His original notion is he'll send a force to attack their rear guard. And there'll be a little action, a little victory, it'll look nice. What happens at Monmouth is when the force he sends out, which is led by General Charles Lee, finds not the rear guard, but the entire army. So by the middle of the day, the American plans are in total disarray. And all the work at Valley Forge of training a professional army, all of that looks like it's going to be wasted, just frittered away.
When Washington stepped in, he quickly turned the situation around. By the end of the day, the Americans had taken the field. The American soldiers also had a little help from the ladies.
The generic term was Molly Pitcher, and pitcher came literally from the fact that they carried pitchers of water, both to the men on the line and to cool down the cannon, because you couldn't reload it if it was so hot after it had been shot. Molly Ludwig Hayes is probably the prototype of the Molly Pitchers. She was 8 months pregnant. She was at Fort Monmouth, and in fact, her husband was wounded, and she took his place at the cannon. So she not only served the men, but she actually fought. And we know there were lots of these Molly Pitchers who saw combat because they all sued the government for military pensions afterwards.
Patriotism in the female sex is the most disinterested of all virtues.
Women raised funds. They went down the streets of New York and Philadelphia and Boston and other cities collecting pewter pot and candlesticks that were melted down to make ammunition. You see country boy farmers marching in silk shirts because wealthy women have taken the cloth they were going to use for ball gowns and turned it into military uniforms. They were spies. They were saboteurs. Many a woman burned her own home and destroyed her crops so that the British Army couldn't feed off it, and vice versa. Loyalist women did the same. There's a famous story of a wife who wrote her husband, first 3 months it said, "Your farm is doing well." 3 months later it was, "Our farm is doing really well." And a year later it was, "My farm is doing really well."
After the battle at Monmouth Courthouse, the American Revolution would have its female heroine, and the British would have a new appreciation for the Continental Army.
It was like the British suddenly realized they're as good as we are. This is a new situation. And what the British do for the remainder of the war in the North, they stay in New York. They never face Washington in a major engagement again. They change their strategy, they shift to the South. After Monmouth, the war in the North is effectively over.
Beat Americans with Americans!
This was a popular slogan among armchair strategists back in England. And by 1780, after the British captured Charleston, South Carolina, it became official policy. The British had shifted the war to the South, hoping to enlist the aid of the Loyalists they believed were rampant among the population there.
There weren't as many Loyalists there as people thought there were. There were always exaggerated ideas of how many Loyalists there were every place. And there were a lot of Loyalists in the South. Most of the people were not really Loyalists, but what historian Ron Hoffman calls the disaffected. These people were going to fight against whoever messed with them, and sometimes they fought against the English, and sometimes they fought against the Americans.
The war that raged in the South was fought very differently than it had been in the North. Here, groups of militia and loyalists butchered each other in brutal guerrilla war. General Nathanael Greene earned the nickname the Crab for his hit-and-run tactics. His undermanned army scuttled in, sniping at the regiments of British under General Cornwallis, and then scuttled away again.
We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again.
Cornwallis won battles, but he was not winning the war. By August of 1781, he had moved his army north to Yorktown, Virginia, where he planned to wait for supplies and reinforcements. Instead, he found himself surrounded on land by American and French troops and blockaded at sea by the French Navy. Cornwallis held out for 3 weeks, but his situation was hopeless. So, on October 17, 1781, exactly 4 years after Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, Cornwallis raised the white flag. 2 days later, a document was signed by generals on both sides, formalizing the Yorktown surrender.
It was as if some great hand of destiny demanded that it all come back to where it had begun. Because there at Jamestown, the British had stepped onto the continent in 1607. And now, only 15 miles away, the British will step off of the continent. Little wonder that some Americans would later feel that destiny had a particular interest in the United States. One of the British officers wrote back to England and said, the British Army is like an iron hammer. Now, the iron hammer seems so strong, but if you throw that hammer as hard as you can into a silo of shucked corn, it bends a couple kernels out of shape, but the hammer sinks down in that shucked corn, and a suit is surrounded, and you never see it again. They could hold New York City, or Newport, or Wilmington, or Charleston, but if they went in the interior ended up holding them. Another, I think, key reason they lost the war is that the French and then the Spanish made it a world war. And it became, from a military aspect, infinitely harder. And lastly, their leadership was not good. It was uncoordinated, it was lethargic. They were simply too confident. And so I think it's also a case of overconfidence, British pride, British hubris. Now, as to why we won. One, French aid. I think it was very, very important. Secondly, the American ideology. Again, we had much more to win and much more to lose in this war than the average British soldier. And I think the role played by George Washington. I think Washington, again, was that glue that held the Continental Army together. And as long as the Continental Army held together, Britain could not win the war.
The American war is over.
But this is far from the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of the great drama is at a close.
I always think of the Loyalists as the true losers in the American Revolution. The English lost, yeah, but as soon as they lost, they could go home and forget about it. The Patriots, of course, won. The Loyalists gave up everything in a losing cause. From their standpoint, it was a world turned upside down, and many of them never really understood what happened to them.
Before the Revolution, women were thought of as incapable of rational thought. Not just the Revolution, but Enlightenment theory as well, led to a notion that not only were women capable of rational thought, but were morally superior to men. And what this leads to in practical terms is a revolution in women's education. And we all know what happens when you get educated.
As a part of the American creed, a commitment to the ideas of equality and liberty became a part of the way that Americans thought about things in their politics and political life and so on. One effect of this emphasis on liberty and equality was that throughout the North, in one way or another, efforts were made to end the institution of slavery.
In the short term, it's a disaster for American Indians. The Americans tell them, your land has been surrendered by the British. And here, the Indian peoples are absolutely shocked. They weren't defeated. The British had no right to cede these lands, and yet they find themselves now treated as a conquered people by the United States.
All of the consequences that flowed from the creation of new governments, which had all kinds of social and cultural consequences, create a world by the early 19th century which is totally different. Richard Price, the Unitarian minister and political radical in London, says this is the second greatest event in the history of the world, the birth of Christ being the first. So there is this extraordinary sense, I think, among people that something important has happened.